Welcome to the First Mentor podcast. Here, you will hear us talk about a variety of topics for the entire family that will hopefully spark a discussion, create a new curiosity, or simply teach you something new. The goal is to inspire you to learn life skills and soft skills not taught in school and prepare you to live an extraordinary life. Come on and spend some time with us on your commute to school or anytime you're free.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to episode 25 of the First Mentor podcast. And this is your host and mentor, Vanessa Yang. And today we'll be talking about one of the most important soft skills, in my opinion at least, which is verbal communications. And for this, I have invited Traci G Lee to join me. And Traci is an award-winning producer with experience in journalism, digital media, and video as well as audio production. And currently she's the growth and insights editor for game shows such as Wheel of Fortune and Jeopardy. And her prior experience include working for NBC News, producing and co-hosting the Dawson Speaks podcast, in addition to teaching and mentoring at the University of Southern California, Annenberg School for Communications and Journalism. So don't miss this episode as we're sharing really helpful tips on how to improve your communication skills. Please remember to subscribe or add us to your favorite podcast list and tell all your friends and family to check out First Mentor Podcast. And without further delay, here's our interview with Traci. And I would like to welcome Traci Lee to our podcast today. Welcome, Traci.
Hi, thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks for coming on. I'm really excited to talk to you because I think I have so much to learn. But I wanted to catch up our listeners first a little bit. If you could share with us about your background and how you started your career in journalism and media and production. And also I wanted to know, was this your dream when you were growing up, or was this just something you fell into?
Yeah, those are all really good questions. And I feel like sometimes people ask me, oh, when did you know you wanted to be a journalist? Or when did you figure out what you wanted to do when you quote unquote grew up? I feel like I'm still figuring it out sometimes.
Same here.
Yeah. I mean, so I majored in journalism in college, but that wasn't ever really a dream of mine. You know, my parents they're big fans of watching local news and being informed. So much of that is because as immigrants to this country, they came here as kids. The only way to really learn about the country and kind of current events was to watch the news, to read the newspaper. And so they always took pride in being as informed as they could, even if they didn't fully understand like American politics or things like that, right?
Of course.
But so that's how my sister and I both grew up. We grew up always kind of knowing when the local news was on and watching the nightly news. Whenever we had questions about the world, my mom would be like, I don't know the answer, but maybe the news knows. And so we would kind of rely on the anchors and the reporters to teach us a lot. I grew up kind of always believing that journalism and being a reporter like was just so important and so essential, but I didn't ever think it was something I could really do just because I didn't really know what that path was like.
Sure, of course.
Both of my parents are not in that field at all. My mom went to community college and she and my dad got married very young. So it's not like they had a diversity of careers to inform my sister or me what we were going to do. Yeah. But I knew I always loved writing, and I was really fortunate to have some really wonderful teachers in high school who encouraged that. And I picked journalism a little bit on a whim, I will say. I went to UC Irvine. That was my school. And the program was called literary journalism. So it wasn't traditional journalism like newspapers or things like that. It was more long form writing, like the kind of writing you would find in a magazine, or it was more storytelling based. And I really liked that aspect. Yeah. I picked that major not really knowing what to expect, not really having any experience doing any type of journalism, and found out I just really loved it. I really loved the opportunity to interview people because I'm kind of an introvert. So if I had a purpose to sit down and like talk to someone and get to know them, it was really, yeah, exactly. Like I could just ask them questions, and I love getting to know people. And in the process of all of that, I found I really loved helping people tell their stories, especially people who didn't often get the opportunity or the platform to tell their stories. Yeah. So I just kind of stayed in that and was really fortunate that I stayed in the career of journalism right after I graduated. I'm not in journalism anymore, but I still kind of use a lot of those basic tenets of storytelling to inform kind of everything that I do.
Yes, you've done so much. And I know you pivoted again, right? So sometimes it's great because you don't know what you want, but just be open-minded and your career pivots and you do different things.
Yeah.
So it's really great. And I wanted to specifically focus in on the youth, right? Because a lot of people, hopefully, that will listen to this podcast is really, I'm trying to inspire the youth and the young adults. And specifically today, we're talking about communications, right? And as you know, I've been lately actually doing a lot of research on Gen Z. So the new generation, the Gen Zers, are growing up in a digital age. And they grew up with smartphones like right away, and they prefer texting over
Mhm.
actually talking to people or calling them face to face communications, what have you. Have you seen, like, among maybe people that you've interacted with, that specific trend? And do you see any potential challenges compared to your generation or even your parents' generation from those that are growing up now?
Yeah, so I think I fall in the generation of being a millennial. So I kind of grew up right as the internet was becoming
Hmm.
a thing, or like social networking, right? Like
Yeah.
I remember when MySpace kind of started and
Yeah.
when Facebook used to only be for college students and things like that. I used to love talking on the phone. And then I found more and more as I was growing up that I was just more comfortable like being on an instant messenger and things like
Hmm.
that because it felt a little more relax. I could multitask, which maybe is a good or bad thing, right? Because then your attention span is all over the
Hmm.
place. But I have noticed, I spent 2019 through 2020 teaching at USC. And so the students there aren't exactly teenagers, but I do think they fall in that Gen Z category.
Sure.
And I've actually sort of noticed a shift back toward people wanting face-to-face communication. Now, obviously in
Oh, I like that.
2020 during the pandemic, like people aren't really face to face that often. You're more kind of
Of
like on
course.
Zoom and stuff like that. But I've found that people liked phone conversations and face to face kind of one on one, more
Mm-hmm.
personal interactions. And I think there is more of an awareness these days, especially after 2020. I think there is a big awareness of how often we're spending on our screens, not interacting with people. And
Yes.
I do think there's more of a hunger now. At least I noticed in my generation for sure, like amongst my peers, like we miss being face to face
Yes,
with
we
people so
do.
much.
We
Yeah.
do.
Yeah. But I mean, I see that. I think that I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing to not want to have that kind of interaction. But
Hmm.
I think, and I'd like to hope at least that people are trying to find a balance now and kind of understanding, now that we've moved toward a space where everything is online and people
Yeah.
do feel isolated, that
Yes.
people are understanding the balance of like, sometimes you do need to reach out directly and call someone on the
Hmm.
phone or have a FaceTime conversation or something. But it's okay if you also don't feel comfortable doing that.
Yes. I think it's important to know where your comfort zone is and your preferred method of communication, but also be willing to branch out to the other areas. Because I'm the opposite, right? I think I missed being a millennial by a few years. So I'm the generation before that. So to me, in the beginning, when this whole video conferences started, I hated the idea of it. I was really fighting, like looking at people. I'd rather be face to face in person because that's my preferred method of communication. But
Yeah.
the video thing, I was like, okay, now I see myself and I start being so completely distracted. But I eventually learned in 2020 as well, because there's no other way. So this is the way to do it. And now I'm a lot more comfortable doing it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Actually, I would love to hear a little bit more about your experience teaching actually USC students. What was the subject you were teaching?
I was teaching in journalism. So it wasn't exactly like in a classroom kind of teaching. The title of what I was doing there, I was a leadership initiative fellow for USC Annenberg, which is their journalism and communications school.
Mm-hmm.
And so they had this program where they would bring in 3 or 4 fellows into the USC Annenberg environment. And we were all sort of coming from professional newsrooms, mid-level kind of in our career.
Uh-huh.
And the effort or the goal there was to bring in folks who have diverse backgrounds, who don't have like a straight academic background, who can kind of bring a real world experience
Sure.
into the student led newsroom for these students. Because I think
Mm-hmm.
it's really important for people who are studying journalism right now to
Sure.
interact with people who are in the field. And so
Yes.
myself and I had 2 other fellows who were in this program with me. We all have very different backgrounds, but we're all coming from newsrooms and then transitioning to other newsrooms afterwards. So it was a year-long program, and the workshops that I taught or the classes I taught were basically, they call them labs. They're essentially 4-hour blocks of time
Mm-hmm.
throughout the day where students who were journalism students at USC had to do this as part of their major. And it was really about hands-on experience. They were making a daily TV show, like a TV news
Oh,
show. They were
interesting.
doing a twice weekly radio news show. They were doing digital journalism daily. And so myself and the other fellows, we were tasked with kind of being there to answer all their questions and help them and guide them. Now, obviously, this was a student-led newsroom, so the decisions at the end of the day were up to the students, but we were there to kind of be mentors and guides to them through the process and teach them in the process of doing it. So I did a lot of the radio and podcasting side of this operation, if you will, and kind of taught people the basics of sound and how to launch a podcast, things like that.
That's great. I don't know how long you taught, but I would love to hear a little bit about the transformation, the changes from students that you observed who first started the program and then towards the end. Like, what was the biggest gap? What did they learn the most, or what was the need that they needed to fill?
I think one of the biggest things was how to interview people. I've noticed that a lot of, especially on the radio side, and I don't want to generalize here, but the students who gravitated toward radio over, say, being on camera or TV tended to be a little more introverted, weren't used to talking to strangers. They weren't used to cold calling people, right? Yes. Like those are all things that even I get nervous at still doing.
Same here.
And so yeah, it's hard. It's hard if it's not something that you have ever really done. And especially for some of these students who are coming in as freshmen, 18, 19 years old, for a lot of them, USC has a big international student population.
Yes,
and so especially for people who their first language is in English, it's very intimidating. And so I had a few students that I worked with very closely who really loved the idea of doing radio, or they wanted to do it, but they weren't sure if they could do it, really kind of blossom in their interview skills, be able to hold a conversation. The way I view interviews is that it should be a conversation.
Yes,
right? And
I completely agree.
I think everyone who is interested in podcasting kind of feels that same way, right? You don't like doing the question answer all the time. You want it to be a back and forth of like a real conversation. And so I guess seeing students who were just coming up with 5 questions and then they would run straight down it and then move on, seeing them turn their sound around, like I would listen back to their interviews and it wouldn't just be those 5 questions they wrote down. There would be follow-ups and things like that. Seeing them kind of grow in those skills, it's just something that comes with practice. And I think for the students that I worked with on radio, like you could definitely tell how much they grew over the semester in terms of the ways that they wanted to conduct interviews. And I had one student once who was like, "Is it okay if I follow up if it's not a question that I wrote down?" And I'm like, "Yeah, it's totally fine. You absolutely should. That's journalism. If someone says something and you're not sure about it, like ask them to clarify or ask them a follow-up question. That's totally okay." So it was really just seeing them get more comfortable with their interview style was really fulfilling to see.
It's so funny. I can relate to that. When I first started this podcast, I was like, okay, what question should I ask? So I started writing them down too, but obviously I'm a bit older and have a little bit more experience. And I just go back to my personal experience when I meet somebody new, especially on a professional level. I always had questions written down, but if they said something else that was really interesting, I'm throwing my questions out because they don't know I prepared those, right?
Yeah.
And I just go down the topic that I'm really interested in. So it's definitely free flow, but you should still be prepared because the worst thing to do is running out of questions.
Yeah. Definitely. I mean, it's funny because the skills you use as an interviewer, like for me, my most recent job before I was teaching at USC, I was at NBC, and a lot of my role, I would moderate panels and do those types of public speaking events. And I've learned over the years as I was doing that, how to moderate a panel well, because that's not something that no one ever really teaches you how to do that.
True.
And it's so different every time. Every panel you do is going to be different, depending on the environment and the people who are on the panel, things like that. And I kind of had to learn over the years of like, always have extra questions, because the worst thing is to get to the end of your questions and then realize you still have 15 minutes left and no one has anything else to say. And then you got to turn to question and answer, which can always be a bit dodgy depending on the environment. Right. And it's just like, I've learned the hard way over the years.
Yes. I know when I looked on your website, Traci, I saw you interviewed some very interesting people. I assume you haven't met all of them beforehand. It could have been your first time meeting them. So do you have any suggestions for our listeners as far as how to break the ice when you're really nervous? Is like, who is the most exciting person that you interviewed?
Ooh, the most exciting person. I think the first time I interviewed Daniel Dae Kim was super exciting because I was such a big fan of his, especially because of Lost. That was an interview that was the very first time I interviewed him, because I've interviewed him. I did a panel with him a couple years after, and then I interviewed him once more after that. But the first time I interviewed him, it was actually kind of unexpected. I didn't know that interview was happening. And my editor at the time was like, hey, so we have Daniel Dae Kim coming into the studio and I need someone to interview him. Do you want to do it? And I said, yeah. And she's like, cool, it's in 2 hours. And I was just like, oh no. So I had zero time to prepare. I was actually doing another job at the time. I had another assignment. And so I was a little panicked. It was still very early on in my interviewing experience. Luckily, my editor helped me with some of the questions, but that I was really nervous for because we had such a short amount of time and I also didn't have much time to prepare. So it was a little nerve-wracking, but he's such a nice person that it was so easy. It was so easy to talk to him. I was also pretty nervous to interview. I did the press junket for The Great Wall. For that movie.
You did? Matt Damon?
Yeah. So I talked to Matt Damon, Pedro Pascal, and Zhang Yimou.
Yeah.
And I was super nervous about that because when you do a press junket like that, I was doing the on-camera stuff. You only have 5 minutes to sit down and talk to them.
That's it?
You want to make it as interesting as possible because they're doing 30 interviews that day and they're going to be asked the same questions over and over. You don't want to put out an interview that has the same information as everyone else, et cetera, et cetera. And so I was like, all right, I've got to make it different and unique. But there was a lot of controversy around that movie as well.
I read those. Yes.
Yeah. There was a controversy about the fact that it was starring Matt Damon and people were like, this is a whitewashed film, even though the narrative changed a little bit to be like, why is this a white savior film or whatever? So I had my questions prepared, but when I got to the interview, and this is no shade to the studio or to anyone that I worked with immediately, but there was some awkwardness around the interview because I walked into, when you do a press junket, you're in a room waiting with a bunch of other journalists and then they'll call you in by groups. You line up in the hallway and then you all go in one by one. Like you don't see other people's interviews. But I noticed in the lineup that I was standing in, I was the only non-white journalist of my group. A lot of the other journalists of color were in like the print section. So they were coming later in the day, but everyone who was doing on-camera interviews, they were all people who were pros at it, but they were all the same type of person.
Yes, I know what you mean.
Yeah. And so I was a little bit nervous. And then I did get kind of zeroed in on by somebody who I don't know if this person worked for Matt Damon or worked for the studio or whatnot, but I did get kind of zeroed in by someone who was like, are you going to ask him any questions about, all the controversy, all of the the diversity stuff? And I said, well, I have one question, but that's not like my focus. I have other things I want to ask him, but I would feel irresponsible as a journalist if I didn't bring it up.
People wanted, that's the hot topic.
People were talking about it. The film had just gotten its big premiere in China and it had gotten some backlash. I was the editorial manager of NBC Asian America. So I had to ask that question,
Of course.
And the person was just like, well, he might not be prepared to answer that. And they kept trying to tell me I shouldn't bring that up. And I just said, I'm not here to do gotcha journalism if that's your concern, but this is a valid thing that people are talking about. Yes. So if he's not prepared to answer it, then that's not my problem. He can say, I don't want to talk about it, but we have 5 minutes, so maybe we won't even get to it. Right. And I will say, talking to Matt Damon, he was very kind. And obviously I don't think he was prepared to answer the question. He did sort of stumble a little bit, but he wasn't mad about it. Even after we finished, he was very nice. So I'm not going to fault him for not being prepared because I do think that is something his team should have prepared him for. But
I know.
Yeah, I mean, it was just something that everyone was talking about. I was nervous to go in and ask that question after this person approached me because I was like, oh no, am I going to get kicked out? Am I never going to get invited back to these things?
Right. To find balance.
You have to find that balance. And then afterwards I talked with Pedro Pascal, who is amazing. So I just had it totally canceled out any negative experience I might have had. It was a great experience all around.
Yeah. So follow up on both Daniel Dae Kim and the Matt Damon interview. So because with Daniel Dae Kim, you didn't have time to prepare. And I always feel like at the beginning, especially if you never met the person, you have to break the ice a little and warm up. How did you do that?
I don't like to jump in and be like, the first time I talk to you is going to be my first interview question.
Exactly.
I try to, I'll introduce myself, obviously. I'll ask them how their day has been. Sometimes I will ask them a question that's already on my list just to be like, hey, is it okay if we talk about XYZ, especially for these kind of profile type interviews. Sometimes I'll share a funny anecdote of something that happened to me. So I think that morning, like because I used to work really early shifts when I was doing, particularly at that time, I was freelancing for NBC Asian America at the time before I kind of took over the site. And I was also working at MSNBC. And so I had these like 6 a.m. to 2 p.m. shifts. And so I was super tired by the time I got to interview Daniel Dae Kim. And so I would say like, oh man, I've been up for a long time, but I bet you've been up longer. Like try to make it almost like jokey a little bit.
Yeah, I like that.
Yeah, because then it helps me relax too. Like if the person is really stone-faced and like doesn't really respond, then I kind of have an idea of how that interview is going to go.
Yeah,
so I know
so
how to
true.
prepare myself,
Uh-huh.
but try to just make it very conversational. And then even when we start the interview, you know, I'll say something like, okay, we're recording now, or, you know, the camera's rolling. I try to still make it very conversational. Like I want the other person to know that I'm not just reading off of a list. Like, yeah, I have a paper in front of me to guide what I'm talking about, but because the camera is rolling, because there are recording devices, I don't have to sit there and take notes. So I can make eye contact. I can laugh at their jokes. I can say things like, oh, that actually reminds me of XYZ or whatever. And so then they don't feel intimidated by me scribbling on a piece of paper while I'm talking to them.
True. And that's a good point. And then going to the other interview, we're talking about the Great Wall cast. So because you only had the 5 minutes and you want it to be different, that's actually something I ask myself too. How do I ask questions that are different, not the same ones over and over? What do you think about to make yourselves or your questions stand out?
Yeah. So for that one specifically, you know, when you do a junket and only have 5 to 10 minutes to talk to people, I think it was 5 minutes I had with Matt Damon and Pedro Pascal and 10 minutes with the director because it was a translator. Or I have a few questions that I consider softball questions, right? Those are the questions where I know they have a canned answer for it. I know it's going to be their comfort zone. So if things get a little awkward, I can kind of revert to it. And then I have questions of things that I might specifically want to know, things that might be pertinent to maybe an article I'm doing or something that I've noticed people talking about. And then I always have a couple of those reach questions, right? Things that I think would be really funny to talk about, things that I don't think they would have been asked. And that comes with a lot of research. So typically before I go in to interview somebody, even if it's only 5 minutes, I spend like a couple hours doing some basic research. And that means watching old interviews with them, reading old interviews with them, especially around maybe the film or the project they might be promoting, because then I'll know what to expect from their answers.
Yes.
And then trying to find different questions to ask from it. I can give you kind of an example of that. I interviewed a film director, Anish Chaganty, back in 2017, 2018. It was about his film Searching, which had starring John Cho. And I had read a lot of the interviews with Anish, and he's a fairly new director at the time, at least in sort of the quote unquote mainstream space. His film had won big at Sundance, and it was getting its theatrical release. And so I had this interview with Anish lined up, and I had read so many interviews. The film had been out on the film festival circuit for a while, so it's like you don't really have a lot of new ground to break there, right? So then I was just like, all right, I'm going to keep watching old interviews, like go down the rabbit hole. I'm going to go down the rabbit hole of social media. If the person has a social media profile, like just scroll all the way back. And I found an old interview Anish had done with Sundance at the time, where he talked about his very first film that he ever like put out there on the internet. It was when he was in high school. And I was like, oh, I want to find that because I know how people at that age, probably like you put it on YouTube, probably YouTube was just starting at that time. That was the place. And he said it was online still. So I went deep and I found the film on his old YouTube channel. It had maybe 1,000 views on it or something. It was a short film. I watched it and I was like, I'm going to ask him about this. This is going to be my first question I'm going to ask him because he's not going to expect it. And I had guessed this based on the interviews I had seen with him, where he seemed very jokey, very personable. And so I was like, I'm just going to take a risk here and see what happens. It was great because as soon as I asked him about it, there was like this long pause and he was like, I've never expected anyone to ever ask me about that.
That impressed him about you, I
bet.
bet.
And so we talked about that and then it kind of opened up the rest of the conversation. So with the interview with, Matt Damon, my sort of reach question there was about diversity. And I just kind of hoped for the best with it. Yeah, I would say 50% of going into an interview like that is kind of just taking a shot in the dark. And sometimes it's not going to work out. I've definitely had interviews that didn't work out or they kind of went south in the midst of talking. But I was lucky that in a junket kind of setting, there's so many people around that an actor or a director, someone you're talking to, like, I don't think that person would ever feel uncomfortable just because like they have the higher ground there, right? You're surrounded by people who worked on this film. If one journalist is asking you something that makes you uncomfortable, there are plenty of people to step in and be like, okay, interview's over or whatever.
Time out.
Yeah. So I was really the one feeling at a disadvantage there. Yeah. It's really just, it is taking a bit of a risk, but it's about doing your research. Like I go deep down rabbit holes when I'm about to interview someone, especially high profile, because I want to make the most of my time.
I completely agree with you. And for those listening who are not becoming journalists, you could translate it to other parts of your life too. So for example, I can relate to the sense when I was in corporate America and I got the chance to have either coffee or lunches with senior executives. First of all, I was super nervous, but I did similar things you did. I went on LinkedIn and checked their profile. I went on our company intranet to see, are there any articles out there, or maybe ask some other VPs or senior team members that I'm more comfortable with. Like, do you know this person? What's their personality? Like, is there anything I shouldn't ask? Or do they have any hobbies that I could connect with? So do your research. I completely agree with doing your research, get a feel of who they are. If you go to an interview for college, I could assume that's a similar setting you could apply to.
Yeah.
Do some research if you know the person, see if you can find out anything about them. So interviewing is not something we grow up learning or something that's taught in school normally, but that's a skill you could use in different settings of your life.
Yeah. Like when you're interviewing for an internship or a job, or even if you're just, networking, right? I think sometimes the word networking gets kind of a bad reputation there because people assume it's like, oh, networking is just something you have to do in order to move up in the world. But I think networking is about relationship building. And at the end of the day, that's a conversation. And so I think that basic skill of just being able to hold a conversation and learn something about someone, like that's not exclusive to journalism.
Yeah, it's everyday life. That's why I wanted to leverage your story to kind of bring this back to everyday life. And you brought up a good point. Networking sounds like work.
Yeah.
I used to go network a lot, but then I actually started enjoying it. But it's nerve-wracking if you have this vision of you going into a room, everybody's there with their suits on, and maybe some people with their resumes, and you don't know a single soul, and people already in groups. Like, how do you go about and talk to them, right? But even in those settings where you don't know anybody, if you've networked a few times in similar circles, there's chances you will meet somebody that you ran into last time, or you met them 2 networking events ago. So the more often you do it, the better. But even those events, I try to go a little prepared. Like if there's a guest list that's available, I try to see who's on the list that I might recognize, or somebody whose background is interesting that I want to get to know better. For example, they're working in an industry or have a certain position that I'm like, oh, I want that in the future. And then nowadays, social media, LinkedIn, right, for professional website, you can use anything you want. You could research and find out a little bit more about them and be prepared.
Yeah, definitely. And I don't think there's anything wrong with going into those situations prepared. Like, I think sometimes people are like, well, I don't want to seem too rehearsed or anything, but you'll be surprised how many people walk into situations like that. Like, I always tell myself, if I feel a little awkward going into it, I bet there's at least 6 or 7 other people who also feel awkward.
Such a good point. Yeah.
I'm not alone in this. So yeah.
And you mentioned a little bit earlier about storytelling. And that's something I've been trying to learn myself, because as I'm observing over the years, I listen to a lot of speakers, either on stages or even at corporate America, some of the senior executives. And those that know how to tell their stories really well are the ones that connect with me. They always say people don't remember what you said, but they remember how you made them feel. Right? Can you share maybe some storytelling techniques or aspects that you think might be really helpful in the real world that they can apply in different situations?
Yeah. So one of the things I always think about, and that's something I used to tell the students that I worked with as well, think about the difference between the question, how are you, versus asking someone, tell me about your day, right? If you go up to someone and say, oh, how are you doing? They might say, oh, I'm good. But if you say, hey, so tell me about your day, they can say, oh, well, this morning I went to the farmer's market and I met blah, blah, blah. And I found, oh, this thing was on sale. Like, you'll get more of an experience from them, and that can branch off into other conversations, right? Oh my God, I love that farmer's market. Or, oh, I've never been there. Would you recommend it? Things like that.
So asking open-ended questions.
Yeah, because it's something that we think a lot about in radio, right? Because it doesn't make for good sound if you ask a question where someone will give you a one-word answer, right?
So true.
How are you feeling today? Oh, I'm tired. Like, oh, those kinds of things, right? What's the weather like? It's sunny. Think about rephrasing your question so that it encourages someone to tell you more than just a one-word answer, right?
I like
Oh, it's
that.
raining today. Like that kind of, I hate the rain. How about you? Like, those types of experience trading in a way, if that's like a good way to put it. That's something that I think about a lot when, not just when I'm interviewing people, but even when I'm talking to people, because it's so easy to go through the motions of like, this is obviously pre-COVID, but if you're at work and you cross someone in the hallway, the standard is to be like, hey, how's it going? And then the person's still walking. You don't actually have time to answer or have a conversation, right?
True, true.
And not that that's the moment where you should stop them and be like, hey, let's have a 20-minute conversation or something like that. But
Yeah.
most of the time people are asking questions like, how are you, et cetera, as a part of their routine, which there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, it's still polite, but if you really want to find a story, like take the time to listen and then also have experiences to trade with them, right? Like some of the early stories I remember reporting on at a time when I thought like there's no story here, you really find the nugget of information or like that angle or something because of a conversation that you might have that you weren't expecting to have. So I think that's, to me, the biggest tip I can give people. And that's just something that's good even beyond, like we were talking about in a job interview. Like I did so many job interviews in 2020, and the ones that I found the most enjoyable were the ones where it's like, when you start the interview, it's not, you go straight into tell me about your resume and blah, blah,
Yeah.
blah. Like
Let's go
you'll get to
down.
those.
Mhm.
Yeah, you'll get to those things, but it is the like, oh my gosh, I've had so many Zoom calls today and my computer fritzed out. Like, oh my God, tell me about, those types of conversations, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Actually, interview is a really good concept, right? Because interview is so nerve-wracking, especially if you're at the early start of your career. Like
Yeah.
you always think you have to impress the other party. And oh my God, after the interview, it's like, I screwed up. I shouldn't have said this, or I should have asked that. And to me, what I've learned as I have more experience is actually a two-way street. It's just like a conversation. As much as you have to impress the other party, many times from a hiring manager perspective, if I really like this candidate, I'm trying to impress them too. So make sure they accept the offer when we make it, right? So when you think about interview as a two-way street, you feel a little bit more relaxed. You agree?
Yeah, because yes, hiring managers have obviously the power. They're the ones
Yes,
who
they do.
decide. But like, you're right. It's everything. I feel like everything in life should really be at the very base level, be considered a conversation. It should be a two-way street. That's how you build relationships. I used to be really frustrated when I would walk away from a job interview thinking it had gone really well, and then I didn't get the job. Right. And I had a friend once tell me, like, at the end of the day, sometimes it's not about winning the job, it's about winning the relationship. And you never know how that's going to help you in the future or down the line. And so I started to think about it that way and, keep connected with people, even if I didn't get a job. And even though I felt like we had a really good conversation, it's not personal, those types of, I guess,
good
thinking
point.
and mindset. But yeah, I try to think about in terms of winning relationships over winning like one job, which is easier said than done.
But you never know. Maybe for this particular job, another candidate had more experience than you, or they actually already decided to hire somebody and you were just brought on as another person that they had to fill in the quota for. So you walked in not winning, so to speak. But if you made a good impression or a good relationship, they'll remember you and say, oh, I remember interviewing Traci. I know we didn't hire her, but we have another role that we're going to open and she is perfect for it, right?
Yeah, definitely. Absolutely.
Yes, no, I think interviews are nerve-wracking and scary, but what I like to also say about interviews is when you walk in, look around, pay some attention. One thing I do, since I've been a mom especially, I love talking about my kids, and so do other parents. I notice they love talking about their children. So when you walk into an interview room or their office, and there's pictures of their kids there, just relating to that or something. If you see, I don't know, you play the guitar and you see them have a guitar there or whatever you could relate with, start with that. And it kind of opens up, like your story earlier about looking for his first film, right? It's just opening up something and the vibe is relaxed right away versus awkward.
Yeah. Yeah. It's really, even walking into any sort of situation where you're meeting or talking to someone you don't know, like, I don't know, think about it as an opportunity. Like you're having coffee with someone. It's just, you're talking over coffee or you're hosting someone at a dinner party. Like make the environment comfortable for them. And then you'll also feel more comfortable that way too.
Yes. So for you, I wanted to go back with your journey because after speaking with you a few times, I know you're very comfortable speaking, but growing up in an Asian culture, right? I know we are not encouraged to go out and talk all the time. It's more being obedient and listening. It's more listening
Yes.
to what our parents say. So when you grew up, were you very bubbly and talkative to start with, or is this something that came as you grew up with experience?
I was not an extroverted, talkative kid at all. I have an older sister, and of the cousins that I grew up around, because we were all very close, I'm the youngest of 9 grandchildren on my
Oh,
dad's side.
okay.
I think maybe that's why I enjoy listening to other people talk, because that's kind of how I grew up. I was very observational as a kid. I
Mm-hmm.
kind of just watched how everyone else interacted and spoke to each other and things like that. Like, because I didn't feel like I had much to contribute, when you're a kid, and especially when you're so much younger than maybe your older cousins. Yeah, I did not grow up that way at all. I was very introverted. I developed alopecia when I was 7 or 8. So my hair started to fall out pretty early. And I think that made me even more introverted because I didn't want to
Mm-hmm.
talk to people about it, or I just didn't want to be noticed. Like, I didn't
Yes.
like people looking at me. I didn't like doing things where people would look at me. So I never enjoyed any type of spotlight or public speaking or whatever, right? I
Mm-hmm.
think in the back of my mind, I always wanted to be that kind of a person because my sister she's very outgoing, very bubbly, very talkative. And I just wasn't. I was very quiet. Being able to talk in public and these types of things definitely came over time. I didn't really develop any proper public speaking skills. I would say it's almost the end of college. It took me a really long time, but it wasn't because I wasn't practicing. It was just because I still had that mindset of like, oh, why do people need to listen to me? I can write.
Yeah.
That was my tool of choice,
Uh-huh.
right? Being able to blog, being able to write newspaper articles. I was on my college newspaper. I really started to get more comfortable with the idea of like speaking in front of a lot of people, and I guess taking on a more leadership role where you had to be public facing.
Mm-hmm.
My last year in college, because I was the managing editor of my college paper, and you kind of like don't have a choice in that. And then when I graduated, I was nominated, or I was chosen as the student speaker for my commencement.
Oh, so
And
you had to prepare big
yeah.
time.
And I was like, oh no, because as exciting as that was, you're
Yeah,
standing up in front of thousands and thousands of people and
that's
their family and
nerve-wracking.
their friends and the camera that's live streaming it. And yeah, so I had to practice a lot for that. Even before I do any interview, even now, whether it's a job interview, whether it is interviewing somebody for a story that I'm working on, I practice saying my questions out loud. Like, I look in the mirror and practice saying things because I don't want to stumble over my words, or
Mm-hmm.
I want to make sure that I am cutting out the ums or the dead silence that might be
Yes.
coming in between my thoughts or something like that. So even now at 30, almost 32 years old, I still practice
Young.
a lot before I speak.
Yeah.
And I think people don't expect that because, I used to co-host a show on MSNBC.com. I've interviewed a lot of people on camera. I've done a lot of public speaking, but I still get nervous every single time.
Right. And that's the thing nowadays with social media, you always see the best of people, right? The best
Yes.
side, the most perfectly prepared side, but you don't know everything that goes on behind the scene, how many times they had to practice. I mean, I watch TED Talks and I'm like, how does this person remember all the things to say and say it so perfectly? And then I read a book, Talk Like TED, and it's talking about, well, guess what? Sometimes they have to practice 50 times, 60 times over and over to get there. So it's not easy
Yep.
for most people.
It's interesting because you're right. Because of social media, and even I will say this for myself, you go to my website and it's like, oh, hey, she's done all these public speaking things. She must be a pro at it. But I still get so nervous because I've had actually so many experiences where things went badly. I just don't share those on my, resume because I think that's more of a anecdotal exchange of information rather than listing it all on my website of all the interviews that went wrong.
Yes, I know. Because it's like, wait, I don't want to show that because I might want to have specific jobs in the future. Before we leave, I wanted to also ask you, I wanted to create awareness on just different subjects that I feel like teens and young adults should learn and be prepared for to enter the real world. I'm a big believer that communications, verbal and written, is extremely important. But besides those two, is there another specific subject that you feel like is really important for them to look into and learn?
Oh
Skills.
boy. It's so funny. Someone actually asked me this question not too long ago. I just moved apartments and someone was asking me about like living not really on my own, but yeah, essentially living on my own. Like what's the most important thing you could teach someone? This is going to sound so silly, but when I was in college, that was really at the beginning age of being able to like Google things and like watch tutorials on YouTube. And I lived in this apartment complex in college where we had not a terrible maintenance staff, but they just weren't really the most responsive, especially on weekends. So, things break in your apartment. And I remember once there was an issue with like the bathroom sink and the toilet. Like there was a plumbing issue in our bathroom. And it was a Saturday. We could not get anyone to come out. And I was like, I'm going to fix it myself. And so my roommates were like, you're crazy. You're going to break it even further. So I realized, I can Google it, right? I can look it up online. YouTube was starting to become like a real thing for tutorials. So I was like, I bet someone out there maybe could tell me how to do it instead of me calling my parents and begging them to help me. So I started looking and I found all these guides and tutorials online and I fixed what was broken. And after that, my roommates, every time anything was broken, they were like, oh, Traci will fix it, which like for good or bad. But for me, like being able to look up that stuff and like, know how to do that research, I think is really important. I mean, nowadays it's so easy to find those guides and tutorials if you need to understand like the plumbing of the inside of a toilet, right? It's pretty easy to find that. But knowing how to do that research to kind of suss out which guide is going to be the most helpful for you.
Yes.
For me, that's just made me a much more self-sufficient person. So like I will jokingly tell people like the most important thing that no one's going to teach you in your basic classes is like how to fix a toilet. Because honestly, that's something that will break in every household. And just because it is an appliance and appliances break, there's nothing wrong with that. But people are often very like shy about trying to get help for that kind of stuff. And for me, I just think that everything you need to learn, and this can be something like fixing something around your house, or for me, it was like learning Photoshop, learning Final Cut Pro, learning how to edit a podcast. I learned all of those things by looking it up online and then just teaching myself. And
That's
sometimes
awesome.
I think that that's really useful to know, like to be able to figure out what your skill set can be and grow it that way through the internet.
I call it being resourceful because many times in life, guess what? We're all learning. You could be 80 years old and you continue learning. But the important part is really, even though you don't have the answers, have an idea how you can find the answer. Like certain people, a network that you can ask, right? And also learn the internet or certain websites that are really helpful, or community groups or whatever that might be. And just be resourceful. Don't just get stuck and say, I don't know how to do this. And that's the end of the day.
Exactly. Yeah. I used to be very proud and be like, I don't want to ask people for help kind of a mentality. I can do this myself somehow. Yes, there are some things I can, I can Google how to fix a toilet, all those things. But there are some things where it's okay if you ask someone for help. Like whenever I have to do my taxes every year, I absolutely bug my best friend who is much better at math than I am to like help me figure things out. Yeah, I think that there's nothing wrong with that. I do think that because we have the openness of the internet now, like you can learn a lot, which I think is really great.
I love getting to know you, right, Traci? All this information. But if somebody wants to follow you or get to know you a little bit better, is there a particular way to get a hold of you?
Yeah. So I have all of my contact information, or I have a form on my website for people to contact me. It's just my name, traciglee.com. And that is also my social media handle for literally everything. You can find me on Twitter, Instagram. I have a Facebook page, but I don't really check it. So I would recommend Twitter is the best way, I think, for people to get in touch with me.
Before we leave, just to really share the story of how I connected with you.
Yeah.
Okay. Because I wanted to encourage our youth to not be afraid and reach out, right? Sometimes you see somebody and you'll be like, oh, this is far-fetched. They will never get back to me, or probably just ignore my message. But my mindset or my thinking is always, you never know. If you don't ask, the answer is always no. But if you ask, at least there's a chance of a yes versus an automatic no. And that's the approach I've been taking to a lot of things once I got older and wiser. And that's what I took with you. I read an article about you online. And I saw your story and it inspired me. And I'm saying, I'm just going to reach out to Traci. So I stalked you. I found your website. I read some of your other articles and I was like, and there's a way to get a hold of you. I said, I'm just going to email her. If she doesn't get back to me, that's okay. At least I've tried. And you were so kind to get back to me and speak to us. So I really appreciate it. Hopefully this will be a lifelong friendship.
Yeah, I think so too. And I really appreciate you reaching out. So there's a thing that happens in a lot of journalism schools where instructors will give their students these assignments to talk to a professional journalist and interview them, blah, blah, blah. And I personally don't think that's a great assignment. I don't think that that's always going to be the most helpful for journalists to, or for students to cold reach out to just random journalists and try to have an hour-long conversation with them and have that be like an assignment that gets graded. I think that's really tough because so many journalists are super busy and don't have time for that. So I don't always love that approach. The approach you took was really conversational and really just like, hey, here's a personal experience that, I wanted to share. And I really connected with your story. It was for an article I'd written for Variety. And, at the end of the day, especially a personal essay, like it's all about connecting with people. And so I really appreciated you reaching out. Yeah, I do think that you have a really good mindset in that. Like, don't be the one to say no to a connection before you take a shot, right?
Yes,
Like
yes.
you should always at least give the other person the option to say no. Like don't say no to yourself. And I think that's also a good mindset to take into anything like applying for a job or something like that. Like don't say no to yourself. Give yourself a chance first and give the other person a chance too, because you never know.
Yeah. And that's what I wanted to end with, because that's like seeing both sides of the story, right? That's all about communication. And that's what we've been talking about today.
Yep.
So thank you so much for coming on today. I really enjoyed this conversation and get to know you a little bit better each time.
Thank you.
I hope you had some fun too.
Oh, I did. I love having these types of conversations. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And we'll talk soon, okay? Bye, Traci.
Bye.
Hope you enjoyed our interview with Traci. You can learn more about her at her website, www.traciglee.com, which is spelled TRACIGLEE.com. On her website, she shares some insightful blogs, helpful templates, and her personal story. So make sure to follow her on Twitter and Instagram as well. I strongly suggest for you to check it out and learn more about her amazing background. Once again, thank you so much for listening. We'll speak with you in the next episode. Have an amazing day.